The summer heat in Brooklyn had a way of making tempers short and bullets quick. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel learned that young. In the brownstone shadows of Williamsburg, kids didn't fight over baseball games. They fought over territory, respect, and whether you looked at the wrong guy's sister. Bugsy, even before the name, had the kind of stare that made grown men uncomfortable. His friends used to say you could see the fight in him before you saw the punch. He didn't just want to survive the streets, he wanted to own them. By 14, he was running with the wrong crowd, Meyer Lansky's crowd. Lansky was quiet, calculating, the type who would size up a situation like a chessboard. Bugsy was the opposite, quick, impulsive, man who could walk into a room full of enemies and walk out with them buying him drinks. Together, they were a dangerous mix, brains and bullets. They started small, running protection rackets for pushcart vendors, collecting nickels and dimes from men twice their age. But nickel by nickel, they learned the oldest truth in the game. Fear was worth more than gold. The 1920s roared in with booze running through the veins of the city like blood. Prohibition wasn't a law in their world, it was a business plan. Speakeasies needed muscle, bootleggers needed escorts, and everyone needed someone willing to spill blood when a deal went bad. Bugsy fit the role perfectly. His temper was as famous as his suits, and when he smiled, you couldn't tell if he was about to shake your hand or break your jaw. People whispered about him in back rooms. Some called him crazy. Bugsy didn't mind. Crazy was useful. It made men hesitate, and hesitation got them killed. By the time most men his age were still figuring out what to do with their lives, Bugsy had already carved out a reputation in the underworld. He was a man who could get things done, fast, clean, or messy, depending on what you paid for. But there was something else behind his eyes, something even Lansky noticed. Bugsy wasn't just chasing money, he was chasing immortality. He wanted his name carved into something bigger than the city streets, something that would outlive every man who tried to take him down. It wasn't long before Bugsy's work with Lansky brought him under the umbrella of Lucky Luciano, the man who was quietly reshaping organized crime into something smarter, more efficient, and far more profitable. Luciano liked Bugsy's nerve. In a world of cautious men, Bugsy was a wildfire. When Luciano said jump, Bugsy didn't just jump. He made sure everyone else in the room jumped too. But ambition is a hungry animal, and Brooklyn was starting to feel small. The West Coast called to him, not with the grit and grime of New York, but with sun, money, and a kind of glamour the East didn't have. Hollywood was a dream factory, and where there were dreams, there were men willing to kill for them. Bugsy saw opportunity in every velvet curtain, every champagne glass, every movie star's smile. He told Lansky he wanted to go west. Lansky didn't argue. He knew Bugsy's instincts were good, and more importantly, keeping him far from the delicate balance of East Coast politics might save everyone a lot of trouble. So Bugsy packed his charm, his guns, and his hunger, heading straight into a city where crime wore tuxedos and drank cocktails with movie stars. It wouldn't be long before his name was whispered in Beverly Hills the same way it was in Brooklyn. But Bugsy didn't know yet that the road west would lead him further than California, that it would end in a dusty stretch of desert where no one in their right mind thought a city could grow. And it would also lead to the night his friends turned his name into a headline. The train ride west had been long, but Bugsy didn't mind. He liked the movement, the sense of leaving one world behind and stepping into another. Through the window, America slid by. Small towns, golden fields, wide open skies. He imagined what it would be like to own all of it, to have a hand in everything from coast to coast. By the time the train rolled into Los Angeles, the sunlight had a different kind of bite than New York's. It was warm, lazy, and deceptively calm. Bugsy stepped off the platform in a tailored suit that looked like it belonged at a Manhattan nightclub, not a dusty California station. If Brooklyn was a jungle where you clawed and bit to survive, Hollywood was a mirage, beautiful from a distance, but dangerous when you got too close. The studios were kingdoms, each with their own power brokers, their own enforcers, and their own secrets. And those secrets were gold to a man like Bugsy. The mob didn't just run liquor and gambling here. They ran protection, labor unions, and the quiet business of making problems disappear. Bugsy knew how to make an entrance, and within weeks of arriving, his name was circulating in the right rooms. He charmed producers who owed more to the mob than to their talent, actresses who liked their men dangerous, and studio executives who needed muscle without a police badge attached. His smile could melt ice. His stare could freeze it again. Meyer Lansky had set him up with the right contacts: Louis Littleman Campagna, Frank Nitty's West Coast man, and a few local bookmakers who'd been too ambitious for their own good. Bugsy cleaned up their messes, enforced deals, and reminded everyone that while the East Coast might be 3,000 miles away, its reach was long. Hollywood loved him, or at least it loved the version of him that showed up at cocktail parties in silk ties, lighting cigarettes for starlets and telling outrageous stories about New York. Bugsy could sit across from a man, make him feel like the most important person in the room, and then have that same man's pockets emptied by the end of the night without him realizing it. He was a gambler, not just with cards, but with people. He met Virginia Hill at one of those parties. She was beautiful in a way that wasn't delicate. Her looks were sharp, like a diamond that could cut you if you touched it wrong. She was ambitious, street smart, and as comfortable in a Beverly Hills mansion as she was in a back alley poker game. They were drawn to each other instantly, two predators circling in the same hunting ground. Virginia wasn't just a fling. She'd become both his lover and his business partner, and more than once, she'd save him from deals that were about to turn bloody. But Bugsy's ambitions didn't stop with Hollywood. The money was good, the lifestyle intoxicating, but it wasn't enough. The West Coast was still just another territory, and territories could be taken away. He wanted something no one else had, something permanent. That's when he first heard the whispers about Nevada. Las Vegas at that time wasn't a city, it was a pit stop, a dusty little outpost in the desert with a few gas stations, a couple of diners, and a railroad depot. The only people who stopped there were truckers, drifters, and the occasional fool on his way to nowhere. But Nevada had something no other state had: legalized gambling. It was the kind of opportunity that most men laughed at. Who was going to drive hundreds of miles into the desert just to throw dice? But Bugsy didn't see the desert. He saw the lights that could be. He saw hotels with velvet carpets and champagne fountains, showgirls in glittering costumes, and a casino floor that never slept. He saw the chance to build something from nothing, and to own it entirely. Still, dreams were dangerous in the mob. You couldn't just decide to take a piece of territory without convincing the right people. The syndicate, run by men like Lansky, Luciano, and Frank Costello, didn't hand out investments for free. You had to make them believe in the payoff. Bugsy began working the idea quietly, mentioning it in passing to Lansky during phone calls, dropping hints at dinners with Luciano when the conversation drifted toward expansion. He knew better than to pitch it outright at first. You had to plant the seed and let it grow in their minds. In the meantime, he was making money hand over fist in Los Angeles. He controlled bookmaking operations, loan sharking routes, and even had a hand in the race wire service, which funneled horse betting information up and down the coast. He also made himself useful to the studios by negotiating labor disputes, meaning he put enough fear into union heads that they suddenly saw things the producer's way. One of his most lucrative moves was taking over the Continental Press wire service in California. This wasn't just about making bets. It was about controlling information, and in gambling, information was the sharpest weapon you could wield. But power was never free. The more influence Bugsy gained, the more eyes were on him, not just the police, but other mobsters. In the underworld, there was always someone who thought they could do your job better, and Bugsy had a long list of men who wanted him out of the way. Still, he had a gift for turning enemies into business partners, at least for a while. When Jack Dragna, the so-called Capone of Los Angeles, started getting in his way, Bugsy didn't declare war. He bought him into the game, letting Dragna keep certain rackets in exchange for staying out of others. It was a delicate balance, but Bugsy played it like a master. Hollywood wasn't all champagne and smiles, though. There were nights when a producer who'd borrowed too much from the wrong people would turn up in an alley, his smile gone and his debts paid in blood. Bugsy didn't shy away from those jobs. He wasn't a killer for hire anymore. He was an investor protecting his interests. But when someone had to be dealt with, he didn't flinch. It was during one of those tense stretches when the West Coast mob politics were especially bloody that Bugsy finally decided to push the Las Vegas idea forward. The post-war boom was coming, and he knew Americans were going to want more than just a paycheck and a house. They were going to want entertainment, real entertainment, and no one had given them a proper place to indulge without limits. At a syndicate meeting in Havana, a neutral ground where mob bosses could talk without worrying about federal agents, Bugsy laid it out. He spoke about the desert like it was gold waiting to be mined. He described a luxury hotel and casino unlike anything in America, where gamblers, celebrities, and high rollers could come to spend money in a place that felt like both a palace and a playground. He called it the Flamingo. At first, there was skepticism. Even Lansky, who trusted Bugsy more than most, wondered if the desert could really draw the kind of crowd Bugsy was promising. But Bugsy had two things going for him: his conviction and his connections. He promised to bring Hollywood's biggest names to the opening, to make it a place where the rich and famous would flock, and where the mob could make millions in clean, taxable revenue through the front doors, while keeping the real money in the shadows. In the end, they gave him the green light and the money. Not all of it at once, and not without conditions, but enough to get started. When Bugsy returned to Los Angeles after Havana, he wasn't just another gangster running rackets. He was a man with a vision, a project, and a chance to carve his name into history. Virginia Hill would help launder and manage the money, smoothing over the books while Bugsy handled the construction. The desert, however, had a way of testing men. And before the first brick was laid, Bugsy would discover that building paradise in the middle of nowhere was going to cost more than he, or the syndicate, had bargained for. The first time Bugsy Siegel stood on that patch of desert outside Las Vegas, the sun was brutal, the wind hot and dry. There was nothing but sand, scrub brush, and the endless hiss of heat. Men who grew up in cities looked at this place and saw emptiness. Bugsy saw a gold mine waiting to be dug, not out of the ground, but out of men's pockets. He pictured neon lights slicing through the darkness, music spilling into the night, dice clattering on green felt, and a crowd too drunk on money and beauty to notice the vultures circling overhead. But before the neon, before the champagne, came the dust. The land for the Flamingo had been secured through a mix of cash, intimidation, and favors owed to men who didn't keep ledgers. Bugsy didn't care how many envelopes it took. This was going to be his monument. He'd promised the syndicate a luxury casino hotel, the likes of which America had never seen. And when Bugsy promised something, he didn't deliver small. The original budget was $1 million. That was Lansky's number, the one the bosses back east had agreed to. Bugsy nodded when they told him, but even then, deep down, he knew it wouldn't be enough. He wanted marble floors imported from Italy, chandeliers that would make a movie set look cheap, suites big enough for the most demanding movie stars. This wasn't going to be just another gambling hall. It was going to be the Palace of Sin, a place where even the richest men in the world would feel like they were stepping up in class. Construction started slow. The desert wasn't built for this kind of ambition. Supplies came in from Los Angeles, truckloads of steel and cement baking in the sun before the work crews could even unload them. Local labor was unreliable. Some were too lazy, some too drunk, and some just didn't like working for a man with Bugsy's reputation. He brought in men from L.A., paying them better than union rates, but even then, the progress was slower than he wanted. And then there was the graft. Every man in the chain wanted a cut: the suppliers, the truckers, the foremen. Bugsy didn't mind paying people off. He'd done it his whole life. But the desert seemed to breed a special kind of greed. Costs rose faster than the walls of the hotel, and Bugsy's temper rose right along with them. Virginia Hill was supposed to keep the finances clean, make the numbers look good when Lansky or the syndicate's accountants called. She worked the books with a mix of skill and charm, but even she couldn't hide the fact that Bugsy's spending was getting out of control. Marble from Italy wasn't in the original plan. Neither were the imported rugs, the gold-plated fixtures, or the idea of building the most advanced air conditioning system in the country to keep guests cool in the desert heat. Lansky called one afternoon. Bugsy stood in the half-finished lobby, the echo of hammering in the background. "You're at 1.8 million already," Lansky's voice crackled through the line. "We agreed on 1. "It's going to pay off," Bugsy said, his tone sharp but controlled. "We're building the best. People will come from all over the world for this." "You better be right," Lansky warned, "because they're starting to ask questions back here." "They can ask all the questions they want," Bugsy said, gripping the receiver tighter. "They're going to see the place and know it was worth every penny." But not everyone shared his confidence. Back in New York, the bosses were already murmuring. Bugsy had always been a good earner, but now he was playing with their money, and worse, he was doing it far from their reach. On site, Bugsy's presence was a force of nature. He stalked the construction site in perfectly pressed slacks, silk shirts open at the collar, and expensive shoes that didn't belong in the dirt. He yelled at foremen, fired workers on the spot, and threatened suppliers who tried to squeeze him for more. Men respected him, feared him, but few liked him. One day, a delivery of steel beams arrived late, holding up an entire day's work. Bugsy found the driver, a big man with a thick neck, sitting in the cab of his truck, smoking like he didn't have a care in the world. "You know how much this costs me?" Bugsy asked, leaning into the cab. "Not my problem," the driver muttered. Bugsy didn't hesitate. He yanked the man out of the truck, slammed him against the side, and pressed a .38 into his ribs. "It's your problem now," Bugsy said, his voice low and even. "If you're late again, you won't live to see it." The driver made every delivery on time after that. But intimidation couldn't solve everything. The bills kept piling up, 2 million, 2.3. By the time the shell of the building stood tall against the flat desert horizon, Bugsy had burned through more than $3 million, 3 times the original budget. Virginia told him the syndicate's patience was wearing thin. Bugsy brushed it off. He'd dealt with impatient men before. He believed, truly believed, that once they saw the finished product, they'd forgive everything. Yet there was another problem brewing. Time. Every month the place wasn't open was another month without revenue, another month of interest on borrowed money. Bugsy worked like a man possessed, but the desert didn't care about his deadlines. There were storms, shortages, strikes. Even the mob's influence couldn't make the trains run faster. At night, Bugsy would walk the empty hallways of the Flamingo, imagining them filled with life. Women in sequin dresses laughing over cocktails, the click of high heels on marble, the rustle of cards being dealt. He'd light a cigarette, stand in the middle of the unfinished casino floor, and picture it all in vivid detail. It wasn't a dream to him. It was inevitable. But in New York, the whispers turned into warnings. Frank Costello, never one for patience, sent word that Bugsy had better start showing returns, or else. Even Lansky, his oldest friend, began to sound tired on the phone, like he was talking to a man he didn't quite recognize anymore. One night, Virginia caught him staring out the window of their suite at the half-lit strip of Las Vegas. "They're not happy," she said softly. "They'll be happy," Bugsy replied without turning. "And if they're not?" Bugsy smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "Then they can take a number like everyone else." By late 1946, the pressure was unbearable. The syndicate wanted the place open, finished or not. Bugsy knew it wasn't ready. The hotel rooms weren't all furnished, the landscaping was a mess, and the staff was barely trained. But orders were orders. The opening of the Flamingo on December 26th was supposed to be the crowning moment of Bugsy's career. He'd invited Hollywood royalty, Cary Grant, Clark Gable, Lana Turner. The casino sparkled under the desert night, the neon sign blazing like a promise. Guests walked through the lobby with wide eyes, drinking in the luxury. But the magic didn't last. A rare winter rainstorm rolled in, keeping gamblers away. The hotel's unfinished state was obvious to anyone who looked too closely. Some guests checked out the same night they arrived. The casino floor was quieter than a funeral parlor. The losses from that first week were staggering. Over $300,000 gone. Bugsy tried to play it off, telling everyone it was just a slow start, that business would pick up once the weather cleared. But the bosses didn't want excuses. In the weeks that followed, Bugsy poured even more money into fixing the flaws, finishing the rooms, and expanding the casino. Slowly, business began to improve, but the damage was done. In the minds of the men back east, Bugsy Siegel had failed them, and failure in their world had a price. The flamingo's neon glow lit the desert like a false dawn, but to Bugsy Siegel, it was a beacon that drew as much danger as it did gamblers. In the early weeks of 1947, the hotel was beginning to make money, slowly, steadily, but not fast enough for the men who had bankrolled it. The mob was not in the habit of waiting for profits. Patience was not a virtue in their world, it was a weakness. And in the smoky backrooms of New York and Chicago, the talk had shifted from, "When will Bugsy pay us back?" to, "How are we going to collect without him?" Bugsy could feel it. It was in the way phone calls from Lansky grew shorter, the way messages from the syndicate came without pleasantries. Even Virginia noticed. She would watch him pace the suite at night, his shoulders tight, his eyes scanning the room as though someone might step out of the shadows. "You're acting like a man waiting for a bullet," she told him one night, sipping a glass of bourbon in her silk robe. He stopped pacing and gave her a thin smile. "Bullets don't send warning letters." "You think Meyer can protect you?" she asked. Bugsy looked away. "Meyer's got to protect himself first." The truth was, Lansky had been his shield for years, vouching for him in rooms where a single nod could decide a man's fate. But every shield has limits, and Lansky's was starting to crack under the weight of the flamingo's debts. Back east, the bosses had their own ledger, a mental one. They didn't just count dollars, they counted respect, loyalty, and results. Bugsy's ledger was bleeding in all three columns. One afternoon, Bugsy was summoned to a meeting in a small Las Vegas bungalow, the kind of place that didn't draw attention. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. 3 men sat at the table, representatives from Chicago and New York, the syndicate's investors. "You've got until summer," one of them said without looking up from his drink. "After that, we take over." Bugsy leaned forward, his voice calm but edged. "You take over, you kill the whole thing. The place works because I'm the face. I'm the one bringing in the high rollers, the movie stars. You're the one who lost us millions," the man from Chicago interrupted. "Don't forget that part." Bugsy didn't flinch. "I'll make it back." The man from New York chuckled without humor. "That's what you said last year." The meeting ended without a handshake. Back at the Flamingo, Bugsy doubled down. He worked the floor like a politician, shaking hands, remembering names, making every guest feel like they were part of something historic. Hollywood stars trickled in. Jimmy Durante, George Raft, even a young Frank Sinatra, and the buzz began to spread. The casino's numbers improved, but the improvement wasn't enough to erase the losses that had already poisoned the books. Worse, rumors were spreading. Some said Bugsy was skimming from the take, sending money to offshore accounts through Virginia. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. Rumors in the mob were as deadly as evidence. Virginia had her own enemies. She was too independent, too outspoken, and too close to Bugsy. In a world where women were supposed to be ornaments or liabilities, she was a partner, and that made her dangerous. The bosses didn't trust her, and by extension, they trusted Bugsy less. One night, Bugsy found her packing a suitcase. "Where are you going?" he demanded. "Back to Beverly Hills," she said. "I'm not going to sit here and wait for someone to put a bullet in you while I'm in the room." He grabbed her wrist, not hard, but enough to stop her. "You think they'd touch you?" Virginia's laugh was sharp. "You're not the only one with enemies, Ben." She left the next morning. Without Virginia, the walls seemed closer. Bugsy started carrying 2 guns instead of 1. He rotated his hotel rooms, never sleeping in the same suite 2 nights in a row. He stopped eating in public unless he knew every man in the room. The paranoia was real, but it wasn't unfounded. He caught sight of new faces on the casino floor, men who didn't gamble, didn't drink, just sat and watched. Strangers loitered near the back entrances. A black sedan began appearing in his rearview mirror on the drive from Las Vegas to Los Angeles. Still, he kept up appearances. He wore the same expensive suits, the same confident grin. He tipped big, cracked jokes, kept the press charmed. In the mob, showing fear was like bleeding in shark-infested water. But the cracks were there. One night, in a private room above the casino, he lost his temper with a dealer he accused of shorting the house. Bugsy slammed the man against the wall, pressing a pistol into his temple, while two pit bosses watched in stunned silence. "You ever cheat me again," Bugsy said, "and you won't make it to the parking lot." The dealer quit the next day. Meanwhile, Lansky was fighting a quiet war of his own back east, trying to buy Bugsy time. He argued that the Flamingo was starting to turn a profit, that killing Bugsy now would disrupt the operation and draw unwanted attention. "You can't build a reputation for killing your own guys every time they hit a rough patch," Lansky told Luciano over drinks in Miami. Luciano, always the pragmatist, wasn't swayed. "He's a liability, Meyer. Liabilities get taken care of." Even Lansky had to admit that Bugsy's recklessness had pushed him into dangerous territory. Protecting him was costing Lansky political capital he couldn't afford to lose. By spring, the writing was on the wall. The Flamingo's revenues were steady, but the bosses had made up their minds. Bugsy's survival was no longer tied to the casino's success. It was tied to whether the men back east thought he was worth more alive than dead. Bugsy knew it. You could see it in the way he lingered in doorways before entering a room, the way he kept a hand near his jacket pocket when strangers approached. He stopped trusting even old friends, aware that in the end, the man who shook your hand could be the same one who pulled the trigger. One evening in April, he stood alone on the casino balcony, looking out at the dark desert. The neon of the Flamingo flickered pink and gold, a jewel in the middle of nowhere. He lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating the lines on his face. "Hell of a thing to die for," he muttered to himself. The final blow came not from the casino floor, but from the boardrooms and back alleys of the syndicate. A decision was made. Quiet, clinical, irreversible. Bugsy Siegel was to be removed. Lansky got the news before Bugsy did. It was delivered to him over the phone in the kind of voice that left no room for negotiation. Lansky hung up, sat in silence for a long time, and then poured himself a drink. He had vouched for Bugsy his whole life, but this was one storm he couldn't stop. He didn't call Bugsy to warn him. Maybe it was cowardice, maybe it was mercy. Maybe he knew that Bugsy wouldn't run, that he'd face it the way he'd faced everything, with a smirk and a shrug. In the weeks that followed, Bugsy seemed almost lighter, as if accepting his fate had freed him from the constant coil of tension. He still carried his guns, still moved carefully, but there was a fatalistic calm in his eyes. If they were coming, they were coming. And when they did, he intended to meet them standing. By May 1947, the desert heat was rolling in early. The Flamingo was finally humming along, the casino floor buzzing most nights, the hotel filling with tourists, gamblers, and Hollywood glitter. The losses from the opening fiasco were starting to fade on paper, but in the world Bugsy lived in, numbers weren't the only measure of value. Trust was the real currency, and Bugsy had spent his down to the last cent. The decision to end him had already been made back east. The bosses weren't in the mood for redemption stories. They didn't care that the casino was finally making money. They remembered the millions that had bled out during construction, the endless delays, the rumors of skimming, and Bugsy's attitude when called to answer for it. But Bugsy didn't know the when or the how, and that was the part that made life strange. Every morning, he woke wondering if it would be the day. Every night he went to bed wondering if he'd wake up. And yet, instead of running, he began to spend more time in Los Angeles, as if putting distance between himself and the Flamingo would slow down the bullet they had waiting for him. He returned to Beverly Hills in June, slipping into the old rhythm of the city. The streets were lined with palm trees, the air smelled faintly of orange blossoms and gasoline, and the movie studios were in full swing. Hollywood had always been a refuge for Bugsy, a place where charm could buy as much as fear, where the mob's shadows seemed just a little thinner under the California sun. Virginia Hill was back in her pink stucco house on Linden Drive, a two-story beauty with manicured lawns and a pool that caught the late afternoon light like a sheet of glass. They'd been on and off for months, lovers, enemies, business partners, but she had a hold on him that went deeper than either liked to admit. The day he arrived, she met him at the door in silk slacks and a white blouse, her hair pinned just so. "You look like hell," she said. "You always know how to make a man feel welcome," Bugsy replied, stepping inside. They circled each other for a moment, neither sure whether to fight or kiss first. Virginia poured 2 drinks, handed him one, and leaned against the counter. "They still mad about the money?" she asked. "They're always mad about the money." "You think they'll let it go?" Bugsy took a long sip, his eyes on hers. "No." For the next few weeks, he moved between Beverly Hills and quick trips back to Las Vegas to check on the Flamingo. In L.A., he was seen dining at Romanoff's, holding court at the Brown Derby, and walking into Cyro's with a different starlet on his arm some nights. It was part theater, part survival. The more public he was, the harder it would be for anyone to get close without notice. But Bugsy knew the mob didn't care about public. They had killed men in restaurants, in barber chairs, in front of their own families. There was no stage too bright for a hit if the bosses wanted it done. His friends saw the change in him. George Raft, the actor who had grown up in Hell's Kitchen and understood the life better than most in Hollywood, pulled Bugsy aside one night after a poker game. "You ought to take a trip," Raft said. "South America, maybe. Lay low for a while." Bugsy smiled and shook his head. "You ever know me to run from a fight?" "This ain't a fight, Ben," Raft replied. "It's an execution." Back at Virginia's house, the nights grew longer and quieter. Sometimes they argued about money, about loyalty, about the way the desert had swallowed both of them. Other nights they sat by the pool, drinking and saying nothing. One evening, as they watched the sun go down, Virginia asked, "If they came for you tonight, what would you do?" "Pour 'em a drink," Bugsy said with a half smile. "Make 'em feel bad about it." She didn't laugh. June 20th was warm, with a soft ocean breeze drifting inland. Bugsy spent the afternoon at the track, placing bets and chatting with friends, and then stopped by a Beverly Hills barber for a trim. He was restless, not in a hurry, but not settled either. That night he had dinner with Virginia. They argued. About what? Neither could remember afterward. She accused him of hiding money. He accused her of talking too much to the wrong people. She told him she was going to Europe the next day. "You running out on me?" Bugsy asked. "I'm getting out while I can," she said flatly. They ate in silence after that. Later, they sat in the living room. Virginia's house was quiet except for the occasional hum of a passing car on Linden Drive. The windows were open, letting in the warm night air. Bugsy had kicked off his shoes and stretched out on the couch with the newspaper, glancing at the headlines without really reading them. Virginia stood at the bar, fixing herself a drink. "You want one?" she asked. "Sure," he said, without looking up. It was close to 10:30 p.m. when it happened. Bugsy was halfway through an article when the first shot came through the window, shattering the glass and snapping his head back. He never had time to reach for the .38 in his waistband. The second shot hit just as fast, then a third and a fourth. Virginia screamed, dropping the glass she'd been holding. Bugsy slid off the couch, his blood pooling dark on the carpet, the newspaper crumpling in his hand. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, but he was already gone. The shooter, or shooters, vanished into the Beverly Hills night. No one in the neighborhood saw more than a dark shape. No one heard more than the brief stutter of gunfire. Virginia called the police, her voice shaking but controlled. By the time they arrived, the house was swarming with curious neighbors, their faces lit by the flashbulbs of photographers who had already caught wind of the killing. News of Bugsy Siegel's death hit the papers by morning. The headlines were cold and final. "Gangster shot dead in Beverly Hills." The photos showed the shattered window, the blood-stained couch, the pool of red on Virginia's carpet. In Las Vegas, the reaction was swift. Within hours of Bugsy's death, syndicate men walked into the Flamingo and took control. There were no protests, no legal disputes. The casino belonged to the mob now, free of the man who had dreamed it into being. Lansky got the call early, before breakfast. He hung up the phone slowly, staring at the wall. For all their arguments, all the trouble Bugsy had caused, Lansky had never wanted it to end this way. But in their world, friendship was a luxury you couldn't always afford. "He built it," Lansky muttered to no one in particular. "And they killed him for it." Bugsy's funeral in Los Angeles was a quiet affair compared to the noise of his life. A few friends from the old days showed up, along with some Hollywood faces who owed him favors, or at least memories. The East Coast bosses didn't come. They didn't send flowers either. Virginia didn't cry in public. She stood by the grave in a black dress, her face unreadable, her hands steady. Some whispered she'd set him up. Others said she was just smart enough to know she'd be next if she got in the way. In the weeks after his death, the Flamingo began to thrive under new management. The profits rolled in, the high rollers kept coming, and Las Vegas began its transformation into the glittering capital of vice Bugsy had always envisioned. His fingerprints were everywhere, in the design, the glamour, the idea itself, but his name was already being erased from the official story. That was the thing about the mob. They didn't just kill you, they buried your legacy too. The Flamingo didn't pause for mourning. The day after Bugsy Siegel's murder, the casino floor was buzzing, the dice clattering, the roulette wheels spinning. Syndicate men moved in like they were changing shifts. No arguments, no visible resistance. The customers didn't care who was running the place. They came for the cards, the girls, and the thrill of money sliding across green felt. The desert didn't care about the man who'd dreamed the place into existence. The desert swallowed things quickly, especially when there was profit to be made. In New York, Meyer Lansky sat in his Manhattan apartment with a cigarette burning low in the ashtray. The news of Bugsy's murder hadn't surprised him, not really, but that didn't stop the hollow feeling in his gut. They'd started as kids on the streets of Brooklyn, two hungry boys who'd figured out early that the world was easier to take than to earn. He remembered the first time he saw Bugsy walk into a room, all swagger and heat, like he owned the air itself. He remembered the jobs they'd pulled together, the nights they'd sat in smoky back rooms planning their futures, dreaming about empires. And now, one of those dreams, the Flamingo, was standing in the desert making money for the same men who'd ordered Bugsy's death. Lansky poured himself a drink, the glass heavy in his hand. Luciano had called earlier from Italy, the conversation brief and sharp. "It's done," Lucky had said. "I heard," Lansky replied. "No hard feelings, Meyer." Business is business. That was the problem. With Lucky, with all of them, business was the only thing that mattered. Friendship was an accessory. Nice when it matched the suit, discarded when it didn't. Lansky didn't argue. He never did. He had learned a long time ago that in their world, emotion was a liability. But in the quiet of his apartment, with the city lights winking outside the window, he let himself feel the weight of it. Bugsy had been reckless, yes. He'd been a gambler with other people's money, a man who thought charm could patch over betrayal. But he'd also been bold. Without him, the Flamingo wouldn't exist. Without him, Las Vegas might still be a dusty pit stop on the way to somewhere else. Now, all that was left of him were newspaper clippings and a bloodstain on Virginia Hill's carpet. Virginia had returned to Los Angeles after giving her statement to the police. The Beverly Hills house felt colder without Bugsy in it, the rooms echoing with the ghost of his voice, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the hallways. She knew what people were saying, that she'd set him up, that she'd been the bait to get him in place for the hit. Some of the rumors came from within the mob itself, whispered by men who had always resented her influence over him. She didn't waste time defending herself. In their world, innocence wasn't about truth, it was about survival. Virginia was too smart to challenge the syndicate directly. Instead, she leaned on the connections she still had, the movie stars who liked her company, the businessmen who owed her favors, the politicians who enjoyed her charm. She knew how to make herself useful to dangerous men, and she made sure they remembered it. But she also knew she had to leave the country. The hit on Bugsy had sent a ripple through the underworld, and ripples had a way of turning into waves. 2 weeks after the murder, Virginia was in Paris, the city lights reflecting off the Seine as she sipped champagne at a cafe. She told herself she was starting over, that Europe was safer, cleaner, freer. But even there, she felt the shadows. A man watching too long from across the street. A letter slipped under her hotel door without a return address. In truth, Virginia knew there was no real escape. She carried the mob with her like an invisible tattoo, visible only to those who knew how to look. Back in Nevada, the Flamingo was thriving. The new management, men who answered directly to the syndicate, streamlined operations, cut costs, and tightened control. The losses of the past were erased by the steady flood of cash coming in from gamblers eager to lose themselves in the desert fantasy. The casino floor was a symphony of sound, chips clinking, dealers calling bets, the muted cheers and groans of players at the tables. Showgirls strutted across the stage in feathers and sequins, the band playing hot and fast. No one mentioned Bugsy Siegel. His name wasn't in the brochures or on the lips of the staff. To the guests, he was just another dead gangster from a headline they'd barely read. But among the dealers, the bartenders, the pit bosses who had been there from the beginning, his presence lingered. They remembered him walking the floor in his tailored suits, remembered the way he'd stop to shake a hand or crack a joke, remembered the sudden flashes of anger when something wasn't perfect. Some missed him, others were glad he was gone. One man who didn't forget was Del Webb, the contractor who had built the Flamingo under Bugsy's watch. Webb had seen firsthand the chaos of those construction days, the endless change orders, the delays, the fights with suppliers. He had also seen Bugsy's vision, his refusal to cut corners, his insistence that the place be more than just a casino. Now, walking through the finished halls, Webb couldn't help but feel a pang of something like guilt. Bugsy had poured his life into this place, and it had killed him. In New York, Lansky began sending men to Las Vegas more regularly. Officially, they were there to keep an eye on the books and ensure the casino's profits were flowing back east smoothly. Unofficially, Lansky wanted to see if there was a way to build on what Bugsy had started without making the same mistakes. He avoided the word tribute when speaking of Bugsy. In the mob, tribute was something you gave the dead only in private, if at all. But in his own way, Lansky was paying it. Virginia, meanwhile, had settled into a life in Europe, Paris, Rome, Madrid. She moved in circles that kept her close to wealth and far from questions. Men paid for her dinners, her dresses, her trips. She smiled when she needed to, laughed when it was profitable, and kept her own counsel. Every so often, someone would ask about Bugsy, a curious socialite, a drunken film producer, a fellow American far from home. She always gave the same answer. He was a good man who made bad choices. She never said whether she loved him. The Flamingo grew. Other casinos followed. The Desert Inn, the Sands, the Sahara. The Strip began to take shape, a ribbon of neon and sin in the middle of the Mojave. The dream Bugsy had seen in the dust became real, but it belonged to other men now. On quiet nights when the desert wind blew in off the flats, some swore they could still see him, a figure in a tailored suit walking the casino floor, scanning the room with that dangerous smile. But ghosts didn't spend money, and the men who ran Las Vegas had no use for anything that didn't turn a profit. Bugsy Siegel was a story now, one told in backrooms and whispered at bars, a cautionary tale about what happened when you spent too much of other people's money and believed your charm could save you. And yet, for all their warnings, there was an unspoken truth among the men who'd known him. Bugsy had done what no one else had the guts to do. He'd looked at a stretch of empty desert and seen an empire. Las Vegas in the summer of 1947 was like a fresh wound scabbing over, raw, tender, and alive with dangerous new growth. The Flamingo was no longer a gamble. It was a functioning cash machine. The lights that Bugsy Siegel had insisted on burning through the desert night now pulled travelers off the highway like moths. High rollers from Los Angeles arrived in shiny Cadillacs, their pockets full of cash and their eyes hungry for cards, dice, and women. The syndicate had moved fast after Bugsy's death. Within hours, men who answered directly to Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and the Chicago outfit were in control of the books, the floor operations, and the security. The chaos that had defined Bugsy's reign, the half-finished suites, the unpaid suppliers, the reckless spending, was replaced with something colder, cleaner, and infinitely more profitable. Every chip, every drink, every show ticket sold in the Flamingo was accounted for. The cash flow was watched like a hawk's shadow. Skimming still happened, it always did, but now it was organized, predictable, and, most importantly, invisible to the IRS. Lansky understood something that Bugsy hadn't. Las Vegas wasn't about building monuments. It was about building systems. The Flamingo wasn't a vanity project anymore. It was a template. Under Lansky's quiet guidance, the casino became a model for how organized crime could run a legitimate-looking business that doubled as a laundering machine. The front of house was polished, glamorous, and inviting, while behind the scenes, money flowed into hidden accounts. Debts were settled off the books, and decisions about the casino's future were made in smoke-filled rooms hundreds of miles away. Lansky didn't set foot in the Flamingo often. He didn't have to. His men were his eyes and ears, reporting daily on the numbers and the players. And when problems arose, a pit boss talking too much, a dealer caught cheating, a local sheriff sniffing around, they were handled quietly, the way Lansky preferred. The Chicago outfit, led on the West Coast by Johnny Roselli, had their own slice of the pie. Roselli was smoother than most mobsters, with a Hollywood polish that made him welcome in places Bugsy would have been thrown out of. He kept the show business pipeline open, bringing in singers, comedians, and dancers who could draw crowds. It was Roselli who pushed for big-name entertainment at the Flamingo, not just the chorus lines and lounge acts, but headliners who could make the casino floor boom after a show. Frank Sinatra's first appearances on the Strip owed as much to Roselli's connections as they did to Sinatra's fame. The Chicago boys also had the muscle. Where Lansky brought the brains and accounting precision, Roselli brought the unspoken promise that anyone who crossed the house would disappear into the desert before the sun came up. Frank Costello, the prime minister of the mob, saw Las Vegas as a long-term investment. He didn't gamble, didn't drink much, and didn't particularly like the dessert. But he liked numbers, and the numbers coming out of the Flamingo were exactly what he wanted to see. Costello began sending emissaries to scout other potential sites along Highway 91. It was still mostly dirt and scrub then, but to Costello, every flat patch of land was a future casino. He saw the same thing Bugsy had, only without Bugsy's reckless obsession with making it beautiful. For Costello, the Strip didn't need marble from Italy. It needed parking lots big enough for hundreds of cars and rooms clean enough to keep guests from leaving early. By 1948, other casinos were already springing up. The Desert Inn was in the works, backed by Cleveland's Mo Dalitz. The El Rancho and the Last Frontier were expanding. The Strip was becoming a battleground, not of bullets, but of bankrolls. The syndicate wanted more than just the Flamingo. They wanted the whole city under a single cooperative structure. Lansky began pushing for a system that would allow each casino to operate independently while still paying a percentage into a shared insurance pool, money that could be used to smooth over police investigations, pay off politicians, or handle unexpected problems. It was organized crime's version of corporate synergy. Not everyone liked it. Smaller independent casino owners balked at the idea of giving a cut to the mob. Some thought they could survive without protection. Those who refused were reminded, gently at first, violently if necessary, that Las Vegas was no place for lone wolves. One such reminder came when a stubborn operator named Tony Parente refused to cut Lansky's people in on his modest but profitable downtown casino. Parente claimed he didn't need mob money or mob protection. 3 weeks later, his casino burned to the ground in what the fire department called an unfortunate electrical accident. Parente took the insurance payout and left Nevada for good. Bugsy's memory lingered in all of this like cigarette smoke. Among the old-timers on the Strip, his name came up in hushed tones, usually prefaced with some version of, he was a crazy son of a bitch, but some admired him for seeing the future before anyone else. Others saw him as the perfect example of what not to do. Too flashy, too stubborn, too willing to spend other people's money like it was his own. Lansky made sure his name stayed out of official conversations. In public, the Flamingo's history began the day the syndicate took over. In private, though, Lansky sometimes thought about the kid from Brooklyn who'd once talked about building an empire. In Los Angeles, George Raft continued to tell the Hollywood crowd that Bugsy had been a friend. He had style, Raft would say over drinks at the Macambo. Even when he was in trouble, he had style. Virginia Hill, still in Europe, heard the stories from afar. She kept her distance from the Strip, knowing she had no place there anymore. But when she read in a Paris paper that the Flamingo was breaking revenue records, she couldn't help but think of Bugsy's grin when he'd first described it to her. The marble floors, the lights, the music. She also couldn't help but think of the blood on her carpet. The consolidation of power in Las Vegas continued into the early 1950s. The mob learned to keep the city's political structure on a short leash. Sheriffs and city council members were given campaign contributions, consulting fees, or envelopes thick enough to change their minds on zoning and liquor licenses. Judges were invited to casino openings and given complimentary chips. Local journalists found themselves with exclusive stories and quiet reminders about which stories not to write. The Nevada state government, happy with the tax revenue pouring in, asked few questions about where the money originated. Gambling was legal. The rest was just business. By the mid-1950s, Las Vegas had become exactly what Bugsy had dreamed, a city of lights and vice in the middle of nowhere. But it was also something Bugsy hadn't imagined, a machine. The syndicate's control was so thorough that disputes between casinos were settled in meetings, not shootouts. The mob had traded open warfare for boardroom politics, and in their own way, they had learned from Bugsy. They kept the glamour he'd insisted on because it worked. It brought in the stars, the press, and the crowds. But they stripped out the recklessness. The casinos were no longer vanity projects. They were investments, each one a cog in a larger empire. Meyer Lansky, older now and more cautious, rarely spoke about Bugsy. But when asked privately by a trusted associate what he thought of Siegel, he said this: "He built something beautiful. That was his strength and his mistake. In this business, you can build beautiful things, but never for yourself, always for the business. If you forget that, the business will remind you." By the late 1950s, Las Vegas had grown into a shimmering mirage of neon and polished vice. The Strip wasn't a rough desert road anymore. It was a mile-long necklace of light and noise, each casino a jewel designed to catch the eye and empty the wallet. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and perfume, the clink of ice in glasses blending with the whir of slot machines. The Flamingo, once a gamble on an empty patch of sand, was now one of the crown jewels. The marble floors Bugsy Siegel had insisted on still gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers. The place had changed owners, managers, and performers, but its heart was still the same, a palace for gamblers and dreamers. No plaque bore Bugsy's name, no portrait hung in the lobby. To the public, the Flamingo's history began when it became profitable, as though its first chaotic years were just a rumor. To the men running it, erasing him was a practical decision. The mob didn't memorialize liabilities. Frank Sinatra came to town like a storm in a blue suit. By the time he began playing regular shows at the Sands in the early 1960s, Vegas was ready for him. The casinos had learned to use celebrities the way Bugsy had used Hollywood connections as bait for the high rollers. Sinatra brought more than his voice. He brought an entourage. Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Joey Bishop, Peter Lawford. Together they became the Rat Pack, the unofficial kings of the Strip. Their shows were part concert, part comedy act, part drinking session, and entirely irresistible. High rollers from New York, Texas, Chicago, and Hollywood booked suites just to see them. The showrooms filled with laughter and applause, and afterward, the same guests who had been clapping in the theater were losing thousands at the tables downstairs. It was exactly the system Lansky had perfected. Glamour upstairs, business downstairs. The mob's presence was still everywhere, but it wore a tuxedo now. Gone were the days of loud public hits. Problems were handled quietly. If a cheater was caught, they'd be ushered out a back door and dealt with somewhere far from the lights. If a rival casino owner refused to play ball, his liquor license might suddenly be revoked, or his dealers might jump ship to a syndicate-backed property. The city's politicians and police chiefs were regulars at the casinos, always off-duty when they arrived. Their loyalty was secured with free drinks, complimentary chips, and the occasional unmarked envelope. Everyone understood the rules. The casinos made money, the city got its cut, and no one asked questions about how the rest was divided. The Flamingo, under its new managers, embraced the era's style. Lounge acts filled the smaller stages, while the main showroom brought in top-tier entertainers. Gamblers could move from a baccarat table to a front-row seat at a Dean Martin show without ever stepping outside. The casino's architecture still bore the bones of Bugsy's vision. The open lobby, the sweeping sightlines, the idea that the place should feel like more than just a gambling hall. But to the guests, those were just features. No one mentioned the man who had demanded them. Behind the scenes, however, some still remembered. Old pit bosses who had survived the transition spoke about Bugsy in quiet tones during after-hours drinks. He was crazy, one would say, but the kind of crazy that makes something out of nothing. Another would shrug. Yeah, and he got himself killed for it. The lesson was always the same. Vegas might let you dream, but the dream never belonged to you. Meyer Lansky, now splitting his time between Miami and other cities, rarely visited Las Vegas. He didn't need to. The system he'd helped create ran itself. The skim flowed back east in precise, dependable amounts. The casinos were stable, the politicians cooperative, the customers happy. Still, every once in a while, Lansky would think about the Flamingo and the man who had first convinced him that the desert could be turned into gold. He'd never say it out loud, but in private moments, he admitted to himself that Bugsy had been right about one thing: glamour sold. The difference was, Lansky knew glamour had to be controlled, packaged, and stripped of ego. Virginia Hill was back in the States by the mid-50s, living in Chicago for a time before drifting again. She stayed away from Vegas, partly because she knew she'd never be welcome, partly because she didn't want to see what the Flamingo had become without Bugsy. She'd read about the Rat Pack in the papers, about the booming strip, about the endless parade of stars and big spenders. Sometimes, late at night, she'd wonder what Bugsy would have made of it all. Would he have basked in it, claiming credit for every light bulb? Or would he have hated seeing his creation run by men who had never taken the risk he had? Virginia never found the answer. She didn't ask the men who might have known, men like Lansky, who didn't waste time talking about the dead. The 1960 presidential election brought another layer to Las Vegas's strange blend of crime and glamour. John F. Kennedy, with his movie star looks and political pedigree, became a friend of Sinatra and the Rat Pack. His campaign appearances in Nevada drew crowds, and his rumored connections to certain mob figures were an open secret in the right circles. For the casinos, Kennedy's presidency meant a continued light touch from federal investigators, at least for a while. The FBI was more interested in communists than casino ledgers, and local law enforcement was already in the mob's pocket. It was, in many ways, the peak of the mob's power in Las Vegas. The Strip glittered brighter than ever, and the money poured in so fast it had to be moved out by couriers carrying suitcases to waiting planes. But the higher Vegas climbed, the more it drew attention. By the mid-60s, the FBI began to take a harder look at the city. The Kefauver hearings of the early 50s had already exposed some of the mob's reach into gambling, but the public had mostly shrugged it off. Now, with television bringing images of Las Vegas into living rooms across America, the idea that organized crime was running the show became harder to ignore. The mob adapted. They began using legitimate frontmen, businessmen with clean records, to hold casino licenses. The real owners stayed in the shadows, collecting their share without putting their names on paper. It was a system that would last for years, long enough for Vegas to fully cement its reputation as the nation's playground. And through it all, Bugsy Siegel remained a ghost. His name wasn't on the lips of tourists or in the marketing materials of the casinos. He was mentioned in books occasionally, in whispers among the old guard, or in cautionary tales told to young men with big ideas. In truth, Bugsy had become more valuable to the mob dead than alive. Alive, he had been a liability, unpredictable, expensive, unwilling to compromise. Dead, he was a story, a reminder to anyone who thought they could put their own name above the business. One night in 1965, after a particularly lucrative week at the Flamingo, Johnny Roselli stood at the bar with a handful of younger managers. They were laughing about a high roller who had lost $200,000 in 2 days when one of them asked about the casino's early days. Roselli took a sip of his drink and smirked. There was a guy before us, thought this was all his idea, built the place up like it was going to be his palace. What happened to him? The kid asked. Roselli's smile didn't reach his eyes. The business happened to him. By the late 1960s, Las Vegas was a city built on the illusion of permanence. The Strip blazed every night with neon confidence, the casinos thrummed with life, and the air was heavy with perfume, cigarette smoke, and the constant rattle of dice. To the average tourist, it felt like the city had always been there, an oasis of money and pleasure carved out of the desert by sheer will. But under the glitter, the ground was shifting. The FBI, once content to let Nevada handle its own vice, had begun to change its tune. The Kennedy administration, despite its rumored ties to mob-friendly figures, had pushed Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy to go after organized crime like never before. After JFK's assassination, Lyndon Johnson kept the heat on. Now, agents in short-sleeve white shirts and narrow ties were showing up in Las Vegas with notebooks and subpoenas. They weren't just sniffing around the back rooms of the casinos. They were digging into the banking records, interviewing pit bosses, and watching the money couriers who ferried cash from the counting rooms to waiting planes bound for Chicago, New York, and Miami. The mob adapted, but the cracks were there. The system Bugsy Siegel had never lived to see fully realized, the one Lansky had perfected, was designed to be invisible. But in the 60s, invisibility was harder to maintain. The FBI had wiretaps, undercover agents, and new laws that made it easier to tie money laundering to interstate crime. Corporate America, smelling profit, began circling the city. Hotel chains, entertainment companies, and investors with clean records and deep pockets started buying up properties. They had two advantages the mob didn't: public legitimacy and the ability to borrow huge sums from banks without questions about the source of funds. For the syndicate, this was a different kind of enemy. They couldn't threaten a corporation the way they could threaten a man. The Flamingo was still under mob influence, but now it had to share the Strip with competitors backed by legal money. The Desert Inn had started bringing in legitimate investors to handle expansion, and the Sands was openly courting big-name entertainers with corporate sponsorship deals. The mob's answer was to stay hidden behind figureheads, respectable businessmen who held the casino licenses on paper. These men attended Nevada Gaming Commission hearings in tailored suits, smiling for the cameras, while their real bosses stayed out of sight. It worked for a while. Meyer Lansky, older now and far more cautious, saw the writing on the wall. He began pulling some of his interests out of Las Vegas, investing instead in offshore casinos and hotels in places like the Bahamas. His money still flowed through the city, but less of it was tied up in the day-to-day business of the Strip. Privately, Lansky admitted to a few trusted associates that the corporate era was coming. "You can't fight them," he said one night over drinks in Miami Beach. "They've got the law, the banks, and the press. We've got..." "What? A few judges and some scared politicians?" Still, the old ways didn't disappear overnight. The mob remained in the shadows, skimming millions off the top of casino profits. But the balance of power was shifting, and everyone could feel it. It was during this transition, when the mob still ran the city's heart but the corporations were building its skeleton, that Bugsy Siegel's name began to surface again. At first, it was just in small ways. A visiting reporter from New York would hear an old pit boss talk about the guy who started it all. A new bartender at the Flamingo would be told, half as a joke, that he was standing in the same spot where Bugsy once chewed out a dealer. Tourists liked the story. It had all the ingredients they wanted in a Vegas myth: the mob, murder, Hollywood glamour, and a man with a nickname sharp enough to cut yourself on. The casino managers didn't encourage it. Officially, Bugsy was still a liability, a reminder of the days when the Strip was openly bloody. But the story was too good to stay buried. In 1969, a glossy travel magazine ran a feature on the history of the Strip. Buried halfway through the article, amid photos of neon signs and showgirls, was a black and white shot of Bugsy standing in front of an early rendering of the Flamingo. The caption read, "Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the man who dreamed big and died for it." Lansky saw the article and frowned. He didn't like seeing Bugsy's face in print. It romanticized him, made him a legend instead of a cautionary tale. Legends inspired people. And in the casino business, inspiration could lead to ambition, the kind that got men killed. The tourists didn't care about the cautionary part. They loved the idea of a gangster who'd gambled on the desert and lost his life for it. They asked questions, wanted to know which suite Bugsy had stayed in, where he'd been when he got the call from New York, where he'd been buried. The Flamingo's PR department stayed quiet, but the bellhops and cab drivers filled in the blanks. Some embellished the story, claiming Bugsy had been shot on the strip itself, or that his ghost still walked the casino floor. It was nonsense, but it sold drinks, and it made people want to stay another night just to be part of the legend. The FBI didn't see Bugsy as a romantic figure. To them, he was just the prototype for the kind of man they were still trying to root out of Las Vegas. Agents like Bill Romer in Chicago and Joseph Griffin in Las Vegas studied his history as a way to understand the syndicate's methods. One internal FBI memo even used Bugsy's name as shorthand for flashy, reckless operators, the kind who made good headlines but bad long-term profits. Virginia Hill, living quietly under a different name, heard about the growing fascination with Bugsy from friends still in the business. She laughed when she heard tourists were paying cabbies for Bugsy tours. They never knew him, she told one friend. They wouldn't have liked him if they did. He was charming, sure, but he could be a bastard. Still, she couldn't deny there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that decades later he hadn't been completely erased. By the early 1970s, the corporate influence on Las Vegas was undeniable. The Hilton Corporation bought the Flamingo in 1972, renaming it the Flamingo Hilton. For the first time, the casino's operations were truly in the hands of a publicly traded company. The mob still skimmed in some places, but the system was weakening. To Hilton, Bugsy Siegel was part of a colorful past they could market carefully. In press releases, they called him a visionary while sidestepping the fact that he'd been a murderer and racketeer. They framed him as a pioneer, a flawed genius whose dream had paved the way for the city's rise. It was a sanitized version of the truth, but it was one that fit neatly into the brochures. For the men who had known him, Lansky, Roselli, the few still alive from those early days, the idea of Bugsy as a harmless visionary was laughable. They knew the real story, a man who could charm you at dinner and have you beaten in the alley after dessert. But they also knew that without him, the strip might never have started the way it did. By the mid-70s, with the FBI continuing to close in on the remnants of mob control, Las Vegas was changing again. The corporations were winning, the old guard was fading, and Bugsy Siegel's story was no longer a whispered caution, but a marketable myth. The irony wasn't lost on those who remembered. The same man the mob had killed to protect its business was now being used to sell that business to tourists. By the mid-1970s, Las Vegas was no longer the tightly held playground of the syndicate. The mob still had a hand in plenty of operations, but the city was tilting, slowly, inevitably, toward the clean-suited world of corporate America. The Hilton Corporation's purchase of the Flamingo in 1972 had been a warning shot. A property that had once been managed from smoke-filled back rooms by men whose names never appeared on paper was now under the control of a publicly traded company. Hilton had accountants instead of pit bosses, and their reports went to shareholders, not mob bookkeepers in Chicago or New York. What shocked the underworld wasn't that Hilton wanted in. It was that they could do it without the syndicate's blessing. For decades, every deal in Las Vegas had gone through certain channels. You didn't buy a casino without the nod from the right people, and you certainly didn't run it without paying the right people. Hilton, with its corporate lawyers and legitimate financing, simply stepped around those channels. And the state of Nevada, happy to see big tax-paying corporations move in, welcomed them with open arms. The mob's presence didn't vanish overnight. Skimming still went on in the 70s, and in some casinos, it went on heavily. The process hadn't changed much since Bugsy's day. Cash came in through the casino floor, went to the count room, and then part of it disappeared before it ever made it into the books. The skim was flown or driven to mob hubs like Kansas City, Chicago, and Cleveland, where it was split among the families who had invested in the property. But the FBI had learned how to follow the money. In 1971, they opened Operation Strawman, a deep investigation into the Kansas City mob's involvement in Las Vegas casinos. Wiretaps, informants, and surveillance began to connect the dots between the Strip's profits and the mob's bank accounts. For the first time, the skimming operations that had been whispered about for decades were being documented in courtrooms. The arrests started small, a low-level cashier here, a floor manager there, but by the late 70s, the government was going after the big names. In Chicago, the FBI tied the outfit to skimming from the Stardust and the Tropicana. In Kansas City, bosses were caught on tape talking about their share of Las Vegas money. In 1979, Anthony "Tony the Ant" Spilotro, the Chicago outfit's enforcer in Las Vegas, became the public face of mob violence on the Strip. The newspapers loved him. He was brash, dangerous, and visibly connected to murders and beatings in the city. To the FBI, Spilotro was proof that organized crime was still alive in Vegas. To the corporations, he was bad for business. The pressure built, and by the early 1980s, the mob was losing its grip. Federal prosecutions sent key figures to prison, and casino licenses became harder for anyone with a whiff of criminal association to obtain. The Gaming Control Board started combing through the backgrounds of anyone who wanted a piece of the industry, and corporate executives passed with flying colors where mob-linked owners failed. The Flamingo, now firmly under Hilton's control, was one of the cleanest in town. There were still whispers that a bit of skim went on in the shadows, but nothing compared to the old days. The place had been remodeled, expanded, and made more efficient. It was a moneymaker for shareholders, and its reputation as a high-class resort was secure. And yet, in a twist that would have made Lansky roll his eyes, Hilton began leaning into the colorful history of the property. Not officially, not in a way that would admit to anything criminal, but in brochures and tourist books, they started to mention that the Flamingo had been founded by Benjamin Siegel, a man with big dreams and a bigger legend. By the early 1980s, Bugsy Siegel was no longer a liability in the public's eyes. He was a romanticized anti-hero, a tragic figure whose ambition had built the first true luxury resort on the Strip. The fact that he had been a mobster, extortionist, and murderer was conveniently blurred, the way a photographer softens a portrait. The story played well in the new Vegas, a city that wanted to be glamorous and exciting without scaring off families and corporate conventions. The brochures left out the body count, but they kept the sharp suits, the Hollywood connections, and the idea that Siegel had been a visionary ahead of his time. Tour companies even began offering mob tours that stopped outside the Flamingo, telling visitors how Bugsy had been the man who started it all before being gunned down in Beverly Hills. The guides kept the details simple. Too much truth made people uncomfortable, but they leaned heavily on the idea that Siegel's death had been an inevitable price for dreaming too big. Hollywood took notice. In 1983, NBC aired The Gangster Chronicles, a television miniseries that featured Bugsy as a central character. A few years later, books about the mob in Las Vegas began to hit the bestseller lists, often with a chapter dedicated to Siegel. By 1991, Warren Beatty's Bugsy would cement his place in pop culture forever, a movie that turned him into a stylish, complicated hero instead of the volatile killer many in the underworld had known. Old-timers on the Strip scoffed at the romantic version. They remembered the real Siegel, quick to smile, quicker to rage, the kind of man who could shake your hand in the morning and have you beaten by nightfall. But they also admitted something quietly. Without him, there might not have been a Strip at all. Meyer Lansky never lived to see the movie. He died in 1983 in Miami Beach, never having spent a day in prison for his decades in organized crime. Friends said he rarely mentioned Bugsy in his later years, except to acknowledge that Siegel had been both the best idea man I ever knew and a guy who could never get out of his own way. For Lansky, Bugsy's death had been a necessity. For Las Vegas, it had been a pivot point. By the late 1980s, the mob's control of Las Vegas was essentially broken. The corporate giants had won. Mirage Resorts, Caesars World, and Hilton International were building mega properties that dwarfed the old casinos. These companies could finance billion-dollar projects without ever calling in a favor from Chicago or New York. The city had gone from being the mob's private playground to Wall Street's favorite adult vacation spot. And in this new, sanitized Las Vegas, Bugsy Siegel's image thrived. His name appeared in coffee table books about the Strip's history, in documentaries about organized crime, in the patter of stage magicians and comedians who wanted to give their acts a little edge. The Flamingo itself began to sell a Bugsy burger in one of its restaurants. A plaque appeared in the garden area, marking the site where the original hotel had stood. It read like an epitaph, but a friendly one, the kind you'd expect for a rogue uncle, not a mob assassin. For the mobsters who were still alive, this was the final irony. The man they had killed for overspending, overreaching, and refusing to follow orders had become the city's most marketable ghost. His story was a hook, his face a brand, his life a commodity to be packaged and sold alongside cocktails and show tickets. The same city that had erased him in 1947 was now cashing in on his name. By the early 1990s, Las Vegas was unrecognizable compared to the dusty stretch of road Bugsy Siegel had gambled on in 1946. The city had grown upward and outward, transforming into a skyline of steel, glass, and themed mega-resorts. The Strip had pyramids, pirate ships, and replicas of the Eiffel Tower and Statue of Liberty. The hotels were bigger, louder, and cleaner, catering as much to families and conventions as to gamblers and hustlers. The mob was long gone from day-to-day operations, replaced by corporate boards and investor calls. What remained was a mythology, one that the city realized it could sell just as easily as slot machines and Cirque du Soleil tickets. And front and center in that mythology was Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. The shift had begun in the 1980s with the Hilton Corporation's subtle nods to the Flamingo's colorful history. But in the 1990s, the marketing machine took it further. Bugsy was no longer a cautionary tale. He was a character. The dangerous parts of his story, the beatings, the extortion, the murders, were sanded down to a few vague mentions about his connections and reputation. What remained was the glamorous version, the man with movie star looks, silk suits, and the nerve to build a palace in the desert. In 1991, Warren Beatty's Bugsy hit theaters. It was a stylized Hollywood version of events, romantic, tragic, and visually lush. Beatty Siegel was equal parts charmer and dreamer, a man driven less by cold mob calculations and more by a grand vision for a city that didn't exist yet. The film won Oscars and brought Bugsy Siegel's name back into the public consciousness like never before. For a generation that hadn't been alive when the real man walked the streets, Beatty's performance was Bugsy Siegel. Las Vegas didn't miss the opportunity. The Flamingo rolled out themed promotions. They added Bugsy's Bar with framed movie stills on the walls. A bronze plaque in the hotel's garden declared the property Bugsy Siegel's Flamingo Hotel, erasing the decades when his name had been a liability. Guided tours of the city began pointing out Bugsy's old haunts, even when the locations had no actual connection to him. It didn't matter if it was accurate, it was marketable. Tourism in Las Vegas had shifted by then. The old pitch, gambling, girls, and gangsters, was no longer enough. Now the city was selling itself as a total experience, dining, shows, shopping, and a sanitized version of its own past. Mob history was suddenly chic. The 1990s saw a wave of true crime books and documentaries about organized crime in America, and Las Vegas was often at the center. Siegel's story was always a highlight, neatly packaged into a narrative about a visionary cut down before he could see his dream realized. The details of his murder, the .30 caliber M1 carbine rounds through the window of Virginia Hill's Beverly Hills home, were retold with a cinematic sheen, often skipping the fact that the mob had killed him because he was reckless with their money. By the late 1990s, the mob chic trend had gone mainstream. Restaurants in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles were naming menu items after famous gangsters. Las Vegas took it further. The Tropicana hosted mob-themed events. The Stardust leaned into its old connections in its advertising. The Flamingo offered mobster packages for tourists, which included a room, dinner, and tickets to a Rat Pack tribute show. It was nostalgia, with sharp edges dulled, a curated memory of a time when the city was run by characters, as the ads like to call them. For the old-timers who had actually known Bugsy, it was surreal. Men who had once been careful not to say his name in public now saw it printed on T-shirts in the Flamingo gift shop. The man who had been gunned down in his prime because he crossed the wrong people was now a kind of folk hero. Johnny Rosselli had been gone for years by then, his body found stuffed in a 55-gallon drum floating off Miami in 1976. Lansky was long dead. Virginia Hill had died in Austria in 1966, officially ruled a suicide. None of them lived to see Siegel turned into a tourism mascot. But a few lower-level survivors, now in their 70s and 80s, would sit at the bars downtown and shake their heads when tourists asked for Bugsy stories. "You don't want the real stories, kid," one of them said to a reporter in 1998. "The real stories ain't pretty. You wouldn't want to drink with the guy. You wouldn't even want to owe him $5. In 2002, Las Vegas doubled down on its past by opening the Mob Museum downtown, officially called the National Museum of Organized Crime and Law Enforcement. Funded in part by the city and embraced by the Tourism Board, it was a polished, interactive celebration of both mobsters and the cops who chased them. Bugsy Siegel had his own display, complete with photographs, newspaper headlines, and a mock-up of the Flamingo's early days. The exhibit leaned heavily on the visionary angle, painting him as the man who saw the strip's potential before anyone else. His violent history was acknowledged, but in a way that felt more like seasoning than the main dish. The museum gift shop sold mugs, posters, and shot glasses with Siegel's image. His name, once poison in public conversation, was now printed on souvenirs for families to take home. The Flamingo itself went through renovations in the early 2000s, modernizing its rooms and casino floor. But the marketing always included a nod to its historic roots and its founder. Guests could walk through the garden area, see the memorial plaque, and read a brief history that boiled Bugsy Siegel's life down to a few flattering paragraphs. The real man, volatile, violent, and obsessed with control, was gone. In his place was the legend of Bugsy, the daring entrepreneur with Hollywood friends, silk suits, and a dream so big it cost him his life. By the mid-2000s, Las Vegas had perfected the balance. The city sold a past that was dangerous enough to be thrilling, but polished enough to be safe for tourists. Siegel was the perfect figure for that narrative, close enough to the truth to feel authentic, far enough from it to avoid scaring people away. Even travel shows on cable TV joined in. Hosts would stand in front of the Flamingo's pink neon sign and say things like, "This is where it all began," without mentioning the beatings in back alleys, the extortion rackets, or the threats that kept the construction crews working through the desert heat. The irony was never lost on the few who remembered the truth. Bugsy Siegel had built the Flamingo as a personal monument, convinced that his name would live forever. The mob had killed him for that arrogance, and for decades they'd worked to erase his role entirely. Now, half a century later, Las Vegas was making sure his name did live forever, not because they loved him, but because he was profitable. By the 2010s, Las Vegas had transformed again. The mega resorts of the 90s still dominated the skyline, but the city had grown more than ever, stretching into the suburbs with sprawling housing developments, shopping districts, and sports arenas. The Strip had billion-dollar properties, Michelin-starred restaurants, and entertainment residencies from the biggest names in music. Gambling was no longer the sole focus. Now, it was about the experience, curated, luxurious, and Instagram-ready. And yet, among all the LED screens, celebrity chefs, and EDM pool parties, one piece of the city's past kept getting recycled, polished, and sold: Bugsy Siegel. The Flamingo was no longer the cutting-edge palace it had been in 1946, but it had carved out its niche as classic Vegas. Its pink neon still glowed at night. Its retro logo was plastered on merchandise, and its gardens, landscaped around the remaining original structures, became a quiet oasis on the otherwise chaotic strip. In the middle of those gardens sat the bronze plaque commemorating Bugsy Siegel. Tourists stopped to take selfies with it, often having no real idea who he was beyond that gangster who started Las Vegas. Some read the inscription, which painted him as a visionary whose dream helped create the Las Vegas Strip. Few noticed the omissions. No mention of the syndicate, the construction graft, the skimming, or the fact that his dream was built entirely with mob money. The Mob Museum, which had opened in 2012 in the old Las Vegas post office and courthouse, cemented Siegel's place in the city's modern identity. The museum's exhibits balanced law enforcement's history with the mob's influence, but visitors inevitably gravitated toward the romanticized figures, and Bugsy was one of the stars. One gallery displayed a blown-up photograph of him in a crisp suit, smiling like a movie star. Beneath it, a caption read, "Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the man with the dream that changed the desert forever." Guides would tell his story with a tone that mixed awe and caution. Bugsy was a man who took risks. Some paid off, some didn't. It was a safe, tourist-friendly way to describe a man who had ordered killings, beaten rivals, and siphoned millions from illegal operations. Meanwhile, in pop culture, Siegel remained frozen in time, handsome, charismatic, and dangerous in a way that never seemed to touch the audience. He appeared in documentaries, true crime specials, and retro Vegas retrospectives. The movie Bugsy still aired on late-night cable, with Warren Beatty's face standing in for the real man. Streaming services joined in, producing slick miniseries and crime dramas that used Siegel as shorthand for the glamour and danger of mid-century organized crime. Even in fiction, his name carried weight. Writers would drop it into scripts to instantly evoke an image of tailored suits, champagne glasses, and a city rising out of the sand. In truth, by the 2020s, Bugsy Siegel had become two different people. One was the real man, Benjamin Siegelbaum from Brooklyn, a street-tough kid who rose through the ranks by being more ruthless than most, who built his career on violence and intimidation, who saw the Flamingo as both a monument to himself and a personal cash machine. That man had been killed by his own partners, likely while still believing he could talk his way out of trouble. The other was the legend, Bugsy Siegel, the visionary who brought luxury to the desert, the dashing gangster who rubbed shoulders with movie stars, the tragic dreamer who died before seeing his creation succeed. The second man was the one Las Vegas preferred to remember. Part of the reason the legend endured was that it worked for everyone. For the city, it was a marketing tool, a piece of authentic history they could sell to tourists without having to talk about the uglier side of organized crime. For Hollywood, it was a ready-made character, stylish, dangerous, and romantic. For tourists, it was a story that made their visit feel like more than just a weekend of gambling and drinking. Standing in the Flamingo's garden, looking at Bugsy's plaque, they could feel like they were touching a piece of the city's origin story. Even the modern Flamingo leaned into the nostalgia. The casino floor had been updated with digital slot machines and LED lighting, but its marketing still played up its history. One restaurant was called Bugsy and Myers Steakhouse, a nod to both Siegel and Lansky. The walls were decorated with old photographs, some authentic, some staged, of men in fedoras and women in flapper dresses. The menu included a Bugsy's old-fashioned cocktail, and the gift shop sold t-shirts with his face printed in black and white above the words, "The Man Who Built Las Vegas." It didn't matter that the statement was only half true. Accuracy wasn't the point. Occasionally, local journalists or historians tried to push back on the romantic version. Articles would appear in regional magazines detailing Siegel's real crimes and the fact that Las Vegas was already developing before he ever set foot in Nevada. The Flamingo wasn't the first casino on the Strip. It wasn't even the first luxury one. But those stories never got the same traction as the legend. People didn't come to Vegas for reality. They came for the fantasy, and Bugsy Siegel was now part of that fantasy. In 2021, on the 75th anniversary of the Flamingo's opening, the hotel hosted a small media event. The PR material called Siegel a pioneer who saw potential where others saw dust. There was no mention of the syndicate's role or that the casino had nearly bankrupted itself under his watch. A few older locals shook their heads at the whitewashing, but most accepted it. In a city where the past was constantly being imploded to make way for the next attraction, any history that survived was treated like a lucky break, even if it wasn't the whole truth. In the end, Las Vegas had done to Bugsy Siegel what it did best. It had taken something dangerous, unpredictable, and real, and turned it into entertainment. The man who had been too volatile for the mob to tolerate was now safe enough to print on postcards. The gambler who had bet and lost what was with other people's money was now a symbol of vision and courage. The victim of a mob hit was now a civic founding father. And maybe, in some strange way, Bugsy would have approved. Not of the erasure of his darker side, he'd have laughed at that, but of the fact that his name still drew crowds, that people still said it with a mix of awe and curiosity. After all, in his own words, he'd once said, "People remember you for the rules you break." Jake Callahan wasn't the kind of guy who usually took vacations. 37 years old, divorced, and working as a mid-level investigator for an insurance company in Denver, he spent more time tracking fraudulent claims than thinking about relaxing. But when his younger brother, a newly minted high roller thanks to a tech startup sale, offered him a free trip to Las Vegas, Jake figured he might as well see what all the noise was about. He arrived on a Friday night, the strip blazing like daylight, the sidewalks packed with tourists, hustlers, and girls in feathered headdresses charging for photos. It was everything he expected, loud, bright, and too much all at once. They were staying at the Flamingo. His brother had booked a suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Bellagio fountains across the street. The room was clean, modern, and only faintly carried the smell of stale smoke that seemed to linger everywhere in the city. Jake's first brush with Bugsy Siegel came in the garden. He'd wandered outside early the next morning while his brother was still asleep. The air was warm but quiet, the city not yet fully awake. There, surrounded by palm trees and flamingo statues, he saw it, a bronze plaque with Siegel's name in bold letters. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, visionary and co-founder of the Flamingo Hotel. Beneath that was a short paragraph about how he transformed the Las Vegas Strip and created a model for luxury resorts. Nothing about the mob, nothing about the bullet holes in his head. Jake frowned. He'd heard the name before, maybe from an old gangster movie or a late-night documentary, but the plaque made him curious. Visionary, sure, but people didn't just get murdered in Beverly Hills for being visionaries. That night, he mentioned it to a blackjack dealer. "So what's the real story with Bugsy Siegel?" he asked as she dealt him a pair of eights. She smirked without looking up from the table. "The real story? You won't find that on the wall here." She leaned in slightly. "Check out the Mob Museum downtown. They've got the dirt." Jake split the eights and won one hand, lost the other. He tipped her and tucked the suggestion away. The next afternoon, while his brother was nursing a hangover by the pool, Jake caught an Uber to Fremont Street. The Mob Museum was housed in a restored 1930s post office and courthouse, the kind of place that still smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish. Inside, he found Siegel's face staring down at him from a wall-sized photograph. This one wasn't the smiling, bronze-plaqued visionary from the Flamingo Gardens. This Bugsy had harder eyes, the faint curl of a smirk, and the kind of presence that didn't need words to threaten you. The exhibit didn't pull as many punches as the hotel had. Panels talked about his early days in New York, his work as a hitman for the mob, his role in establishing the Flamingo with syndicate money, and his murder in Virginia Hill's Beverly Hills home. One detail caught Jake's attention. The budget for the Flamingo had been around $1 million, but Siegel had spent over $6 million by the time it opened. In today's money, that was close to $70 million. Visionary, Jake muttered. Or a guy who didn't know how to keep a budget. As he moved through the exhibit, Jake overheard a tour guide telling a small group, "Siegel's death was business. The mob doesn't keep people around who cost them money. The Flamingo made it without him, maybe even because they got rid of him." The words stuck with him. On the surface, Las Vegas had turned Siegel into a romantic figure, but the truth was colder. The city's most marketable founder was also its first high-profile casualty. Jake left the museum with more questions than answers. Why had Siegel been willing to risk so much mob money on luxury touches in the middle of the desert? Why had the syndicate allowed him to run so far over budget before pulling the trigger? And why, after decades of erasing his name, had the city now embraced him as a founder? The next day, he started asking around. A bartender at the Flamingo told him Bugsy didn't invent Vegas. There were casinos here before him. He just made the first one people wanted to dress up for. A cab driver claimed his grandfather had poured concrete for the original Flamingo and swore Siegel had personally threatened him when a shipment of marble arrived chipped. An elderly security guard near the sportsbook shook his head. Kid, everything you've heard is half true. The rest, it's whatever sells drinks. By Monday, Jake had pieced together a rough picture. Siegel had been a mix of brilliance and recklessness. He could charm movie stars and mob bosses in the same day, but he burned money like dry paper and believed his personality could shield him from consequences. He also understood something others didn't, that Las Vegas could be more than gambling and whiskey. It could be an event, a place where people came not just to play cards, but to feel important. That was the part the city kept, the dreamer who saw neon in the sand. The rest, the beatings, the threats, the skimming, was left out of the tourist-friendly narrative. On his last night in Vegas, Jake stood again in the Flamingo Gardens looking at the bronze plaque. Around him, tourists took selfies, laughed, and wandered toward the pool. None of them looked like they cared whether the words on the plaque were true. He thought about the mob museum's blunt version and the bartender's half-smirked comment about selling drinks. Maybe in Vegas, the truth wasn't as important as the story. Maybe it never had been. But Jake couldn't shake one thought. If Siegel were alive to see it, his name on t-shirts, his face on shot glasses, his story told like a fairy tale, he'd probably love it. Because in Las Vegas, legends paid better than reality. And Bugsy Siegel, dead 75 years, was still cashing in. Jake didn't leave Vegas. He was supposed to fly back to Denver on Tuesday morning, but instead of heading for the airport, he sat at the coffee shop in the Flamingo lobby, staring at his phone. Something about the way the mob museum's version of Bugsy Siegel clashed with the hotel's plaque had sunk its hooks into him. He'd handled insurance fraud cases for years, and the feeling was familiar. Two different stories about the same event, each conveniently leaving out just enough to hide the full truth. He couldn't help himself. He booked 3 more nights. The first thing he did was call the mob museum. He got patched through to a curator named Grace Latham, who sounded wary until he told her he wasn't a reporter, just a curious guy with too much free time. Bugsy's story, she said over the line. It's like a deck of cards with a bunch of jokers mixed in. Everyone who was close to him is either dead or lying. And the records? You get little pieces in FBI files, in old court transcripts, but never the whole picture. Jake asked if she could point him to anything outside the exhibit. You want the FBI vault, Grace said. They've got digitized files on Siegel and the Flamingo, most of it declassified, though it's full of redactions. And you might want to talk to some of the old-timers still hanging around downtown. A few of them had uncles or fathers who were on the construction crews. They'll tell you things you won't find in print. Jake started with the FBI vault online. The files were grainy PDFs, the kind that looked like they'd been scanned from carbon copies made on a typewriter. They read like puzzle pieces dumped from a box, surveillance notes, informant reports, letters between field offices. One report from June 1947, just days before Siegel's murder, mentioned growing dissatisfaction among East Coast financial backers due to construction overruns and unverified allegations of diversion of funds. The language was careful, but Jake knew what it meant. The mob thought Siegel was skimming. Another file, dated a week after the murder, was more blunt. Subject Siegel was terminated by associates due to continued financial losses and perception of betrayal. No names were given, and half the page was blacked out. The Bureau never arrested anyone for the killing, but the implication was obvious. 2 days into his digging, Jake went downtown to a dim wood-paneled bar called the Huntridge Tavern, the kind of place where the jukebox still had CDs and the beer was cheap. He struck up a conversation with a man in his 70s who introduced himself as Eddie. Eddie's father, it turned out, had been a carpenter on the Flamingo job in '46. "My old man said Siegel was a pain in the ass," Eddie told him over a glass of whiskey. "Wanted things done just so. Imported marble, fancy fixtures, custom this and custom that. If something wasn't perfect, he'd blow his top. Once threw a lamp at a foreman." "Did your dad ever meet him?" Jake asked. "Oh yeah. Said he was charming when he wanted to be. Could talk a guy into working double shifts, then stiff him on the pay if the mob decided to cut costs that week. But he also said the crews got fed. Good food too, steaks and everything. Siegel wanted people to think they were building a palace." When Jake asked about the murder, Eddie leaned back and shook his head. "My dad said everyone knew it was coming. Word was out for weeks. But nobody knew when or where until it happened." Later that night, back at the Flamingo, Jake thought about that. The idea that Siegel had been a dead man walking for weeks. If that was true, then his decision to hang around Los Angeles instead of fleeing meant one of two things. Either he believed his own hype and thought he was untouchable, or he decided he'd rather go out standing still than running. Both fit the man he'd been reading about. Grace from the Mob Museum called him back on Thursday morning. "I thought of someone you might want to talk to," she said. "His name's Frank Valenti. Used to be in the casino business, now retired. He's pushing 90, but he's sharp. Claims his uncle was in the Beverly Hills house the night Siegel got hit." An hour later, Jake was in a quiet retirement home on the edge of the city. Frank was small, wiry, with eyes that seemed to weigh Jake before deciding he was worth talking to. "You want to know about Bugsy," Frank said. "Everyone does. But most of what people think they know is crap. Hollywood crap." Jake told him he'd heard Frank's uncle had been there. "Yeah," Frank said slowly. "Uncle Lou was in the kitchen. Virginia Hill was in the house too. Lou told me Bugsy was on the couch reading a paper. Windows open. Real quiet night. Then, bang. Glass everywhere. Lou hit the floor and stayed there till it stopped." "Who pulled the trigger?" Jake asked. Frank gave him a look. "If Lou knew, he didn't say. Or maybe he didn't want to say, but I'll tell you this. It wasn't some stranger. Whoever did it, Bugsy probably knew him. That's why he didn't see it coming." The ride back to the Flamingo felt heavier. Jake had read enough about mob hits to know they rarely came from outside the circle. You didn't kill a man like Siegel without a green light from people who had once called him a friend. It also explained why no one had ever been charged. The witnesses were all tied to the same world, and none of them were going to open their mouths. That night, Jake sat in the Flamingo Gardens again, looking at the plaque. He thought about the FBI's careful language, Eddie's stories from his father, Frank's account of the shooting. The picture forming in his mind was a lot messier than the official narrative. Siegel hadn't just been a visionary. He'd been a man who believed his own charm was stronger than the rules of the world he lived in. Maybe he had skimmed. Maybe he hadn't. But he'd crossed the one line that mattered. He'd stopped being useful to the people who paid for his dream. And in that world, you didn't get to keep breathing once you stopped being useful. Jake realized something else. Las Vegas didn't hide this truth because they were afraid of it. They hid it because it was bad for business. A visionary founder who died tragically. That sold hotel rooms. A reckless mobster who got himself killed for breaking the wrong rules. That didn't sell cocktails in Bugsy's bar. For the first time since he'd arrived, Jake felt like he'd actually seen the man behind the legend. And he wasn't sure which version Las Vegas would be happier if he talked about. Frank Valenti's words wouldn't leave Jake's head. It wasn't some stranger. Bugsy probably knew him. That was more than just speculation. It felt like the kind of truth people carried for decades without speaking aloud. And if Frank's uncle had been in the house, then the family might have known a hell of a lot more than they ever put on record. Jake had already spent the better part of a week chasing this thing, and now he was too far in to walk away. He wasn't even sure why he cared so much. It wasn't like bringing the truth to light would change anything. Bugsy Siegel had been dead for 75 years. But the investigator in him hated unsolved cases, especially the kind where the answer had been hiding in plain sight all along. The next morning, Jake went back to see Frank. The retirement home's halls smelled faintly of bleach and something sweeter, like boiled fruit. Frank was sitting at a small table by the window, reading the sports page with a magnifying glass. "You again," Frank said without looking up. Jake sat down. "You didn't tell me everything." Frank's mouth twitched. "Nobody ever tells everything. I'm not here to write a book. I'm not a reporter. I want to know what really happened to him. Who made the call?" Frank set the paper down. His eyes were sharp despite the years. "You think knowing would make you feel better?" "It's not about feeling better. It's about knowing." Frank was quiet for a long time, then said, "There's one man left who might talk. He's 95, living out in Henderson. Name's Salvatore Rizzo. He was a go-between back then. Ran messages, moved envelopes. Never big enough to be a target, smart enough to keep his mouth shut." 2 hours later, Jake was parked outside a sun-baked stucco house in a quiet Henderson neighborhood. A rusting Cadillac sat in the driveway, its paint the same faded turquoise as the desert sky. Rizzo answered the door slowly, leaning on a cane. He was thin as a broom handle, his skin like parchment, but his eyes were still watchful. "You're not a cop," he said after a long look. "No," Jake said. "I'm looking into Bugsy Siegel's death." The old man's laugh was dry as sand. "Everybody's looking into Bugsy Siegel's death. Half the people who ask me think I'm going to tell them some Hollywood story. I tell them I don't know nothing. They go away happy." "I'm not looking for the Hollywood version," Jake said. That got him an invitation inside. Rizzo's living room was a shrine to another time. Black and white photographs of men in suits, a bar cart stocked with bottles old enough to be antiques, the faint smell of cigars. "You want a drink?" Rizzo asked. Jake shook his head. "You're wasting your time," Rizzo said, lowering himself into an armchair. "The people who ordered that job are dust. The guy who pulled the trigger? Dust, too. Only thing left is stories, and you can't put stories on trial." "Frank Valenti said you were moving messages in 47, Jake said. Rizzo smiled faintly. "Frank's got a big mouth for a guy his age," Jake pressed. "Was it Lansky?" "No." "Luciano?" Rizzo shook his head. "Lucky was in Italy. Lansky. He didn't want it, but he didn't stop it. That's all I'll say about him." "Then who?" The old man's eyes narrowed. "You want a name, but you don't understand what that means. That name's been in the ground 70 years, but it still carries weight with people who'd rather it stayed buried. You think they won't care just because it's history? You'd be wrong." Jake leaned forward. "Then why tell me anything at all?" Rizzo's voice dropped. "Because people get Siegel wrong. They think he was killed for skimming, for stealing. That wasn't it. The money, yeah, it was bad. But the real problem was, he stopped being part of the outfit. Started thinking the flamingo was his, that it made him untouchable. You can't be untouchable in that world. Nobody is." It was the same pattern Jake had seen 100 times in smaller modern cases. Someone forgets where the lines are, assumes their success makes them immune, and finds out too late that rules are rules. "Give me the name," Jake said. Rizzo looked at him for a long time, then said, "Mo Sedway." He was the syndicate's man in Vegas, close to Lansky. Siegel treated him like dirt, pushed him out of the Flamingo. Sedway was the one who convinced the bosses it was time. Jake recognized the name from the FBI files. Sedway had taken over the Flamingo almost immediately after Siegel's murder. It made sense, too much sense. Rizzo wasn't finished. It wasn't personal for Sedway, it was business. You kill a man like Siegel, and you get a warning out to 100 other guys. That's how it works. He was replaced. The place made money, end of story. Jake scribbled the name in his notebook, even though he knew there was no way to prove it beyond Rizzo's word. Sedway had died in 1952. There was no confession, no surviving hitman, nothing the law could do with it. "What are you going to do with that?" Rizzo asked. "I don't know yet." Back at the Flamingo that night, Jake walked the casino floor. The lights were bright, the slots chimed endlessly, and the air was thick with perfume and desperation. In the gardens, tourists laughed as they took pictures with Bugsy's plaque. oblivious to the fact that the man they were smiling about had been murdered on the orders of someone he probably thought was beneath him. Jake thought about writing it all down, maybe pitching it as a feature to a magazine. But he also thought about what Rizzo had said, about names that still carried weight. Even if the man was long dead, the myth was profitable, and Vegas didn't like anyone messing with its money. He could already imagine the PR spin if the story broke, the Flamingo dismissing it as unverified gossip, the mob museum saying it was one interpretation, the rest of the city ignoring it altogether. And maybe that was the point. The truth wasn't just buried, it was irrelevant. The next day, Jake packed his bag. Before leaving, he took one last walk through the garden and stood in front of the plaque. The bronze letters gleamed in the morning sun. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, visionary and co-founder. Jake knew the other truth now, the one about budgets, power, and the man who decided Siegel's time was up. But standing there, he realized something uncomfortable. The legend was cleaner, easier. People wanted the dreamer, not the warning. He touched the edge of the plaque, then turned away. Some truths, he decided, were better left in the shadows, not because they didn't matter, but because the people who cared were already gone. And the people who were left, they'd rather have the story. The plane ride back to Denver felt quieter than Jake expected. It wasn't that the cabin was silent. A baby was crying a few rows back. A pair of businessmen were talking too loudly about quarterly numbers. But his mind was elsewhere. He kept seeing Bugsy Siegel's face, not the Hollywood version, not the bronze plaque smiling visionary, but the one from the mob museum wall, sharp-eyed, restless, a man who was always calculating the next move. And under that, the name Salvatore Rizzo had given him, Mo Sedway. It fit too perfectly. The friction, the takeover, the timing. It was one of those truths that doesn't need paperwork to make sense. But now Jake had to live with the same choice Vegas had made decades ago. Tell the real story, or let the legend stand. When he landed in Denver, he went back to work like nothing had happened. On paper, it was just another trip. He filed claims, interviewed clients, argued with adjusters over payouts. But the investigation lingered in the background, like a song stuck on repeat. A week after he got home, his brother sent him a photo. It was from the Flamingo Gardens, his brother grinning next to the Bugsy plaque, a frozen drink in one hand. The text underneath read, "Best weekend ever. You missed out by leaving early." Jake didn't reply. He just stared at the image for a long time. His brother hadn't missed out on anything. He'd gotten exactly what Vegas wanted him to get. The story, the neon, the drink, the selfie. The truth wasn't part of the package. 2 months later, Jake got a padded envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice and a black and white photograph. The paper said, "Now you know why it stayed quiet." The photo showed a group of men in suits standing outside the Flamingo in 1947. Jake recognized two of them from his research, Meyer Lansky and Mo Sedway. The rest were faces he couldn't name. But it was the timing that mattered. The photo had been taken within days of Siegel's murder. Sedway was already smiling like the casino belonged to him. Jake tucked the envelope away in a drawer. He didn't go back to Vegas for another year. When he did, it wasn't for gambling or shows. It was for closure, or maybe curiosity. The city had changed again in small ways. New LED billboards, another hotel imploded to make way for something bigger, a different set of celebrities on the marquee. But the Flamingo was still there, still glowing pink against the night sky, still selling the same story. Jake walked through the lobby, past the casino floor, and into the gardens. The plaque was unchanged. Tourists still clustered around it, smiling for photos, listening to each other read the inscription aloud. He stood back watching them. None of them wanted to know about construction overruns, mob politics, or the man in Henderson who had finally said the name. They wanted the dream. And maybe, Jake thought, that was what Siegel had understood all along. The dream mattered more than the details. It occurred to him then that Las Vegas wasn't just built on gambling, or even on money. It was built on storytelling. Every casino, every showroom, every neon sign was part of a story someone wanted you to believe. and the city didn't care if that story was true, as long as it kept you playing. Bugsy Siegel's story had been rewritten more than once. In life, he'd been a dangerous man who treated the world like a chessboard. In death, he'd been a liability erased from the record. Decades later, he was a brand, a piece of old Vegas nostalgia you could sip in a cocktail or wear on a t-shirt. And in the end, all three versions were true, just not at the same time. Jake sat at the bar in Bugsy and Meyer's steakhouse that night. The place was polished, with leather booths and framed photos of mob figures on the walls. Sinatra played softly over the speakers. The bartender poured him an old-fashioned without being asked. "First time here?" "No," Jake said, "but I guess you could say I've been researching." The bartender grinned. "Let me guess, Bugsy?" Jake took a sip. "Something like that." "You want my advice?" the bartender said. "Don't research too hard. The stories are better when they are not true." When Jake left the Flamingo the next morning, he didn't stop in the gardens. He'd seen the plaque enough times. Instead, he walked out to the strip and let the noise and light swallow him up. He realized something then. The truth about Siegel's murder wasn't going to change the city. The people who cared about the real details were gone, and the people who were left didn't want them. Vegas wasn't a place for truth. It was a place for the best version of the truth you could sell. As the desert sun climbed higher, Jake thought about the photograph in his drawer back in Denver, Sedway's smile in 1947, the same smile that had likely followed Siegel's last breath. That was the truth, and it would stay in the drawer. Not because Jake was afraid, but because he finally understood the city's unspoken rule. In Las Vegas, the house always wins, and the house runs on stories. Bugsy Siegel's grave in Los Angeles still gets visitors. Most are tourists, some are mob history buffs, a few are relatives of men who knew him. Flowers appear there on his birthday, though no one ever admits to leaving them. In Las Vegas, his name is stamped on menus, gift shop mugs, and glossy tourist brochures. The real man, the one who could smile and threaten you in the same breath, is long gone. What's left is a ghost shaped to fit the city's needs. And maybe that's fitting. In the end, Bugsy got what he wanted. His name is still on everyone's lips. It just belongs to Las Vegas now.